Thank you for joining us tonight for the real conversation, understanding white supremacy, decoding the actions of the white power movement. My name is Josh Goldberg. I'm class of 2003, graduate from the Simon Business School. I'm very excited about tonight's conversation. It's a very powerful conversation, very timely topic. I'm also a member of the Diversity Advisory Council and Simon's Alumni Board. On a personal note, I grew up in a working class community in Albany, Schenectady area, and I'm familiar with the bigotry that exists in some of those communities, as largely as a result, perhaps, of poorer folks wanting to feel superior to other folks. But I'm reminded tonight of a potentially dangerous element and violent element that could be a slippery slope to, and very interested in learning more about its potential connection to the white power movement. Tonight's Real, Rochester's Equity and Access Leadership Conversation, is central to the work of the Diversity Advisory Council, not only to ensure that we as a university engage in candid and courageous conversation, listen to each other, but also to understand what actions are possible to address these issues effectively. Now more than ever, it's essential to confront all forms of racism, bias, hatred, oppression, and violence that are pervasive and affect us in our daily reality. Facing these issues is imperative for this university community that is diverse, welcoming, and inclusive for all alumni and students. We remain ever more committed to having authentic conversations like we have in Real Conversations, featuring brave and candid dialogues around equity, measurable action, and meaningful change. We'll do that tonight with our speaker, Dr. Kathleen Blue, and moderator, Dr. Jeffrey McCune. The Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement and the Diversity Advisory Council, in partnership with the Frederick Douglass Institute and Department of Black Studies and Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion, present today's Real Conversation. Next, I will pass it on to Dr. McCune, Frederick Douglass's Associate Professor of African American Literature and Culture and Director, Frederick Douglass Institute for African and African American Studies here at the University of Rochester.
Thank you, Josh, so much. And you are right. The important time is now, and the issue of the hour is so important to engage. Issues of white supremacy, issues of anti-Blackness have been just growing, right, throughout our communities and our society. And so I am honored to be a part of this conversation as a strong opponent of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, but also one that truly believes that unfortunately so many of us house white supremacist ideas and anti-Black ideas. All of us grew up in a country largely built on principles of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and anti-Native, and anti-Indigenous, right? And so an anti-difference. And so what we're trying to do today is really get at what does that mean? How do we approach it? And we're doing that with the great, and I say great because I've seen Dr. Kathleen Blue speak before. And so it's a great treat and honor to be in her presence. She's a person who handles this conversation with much care, but also with much critical engagement. Dr. Kathleen Blue is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University. She earned tenure at the University of Chicago in 2021, where she spent 7 years. Her research has received the support of the Chauncey and Marion Deering McCormick Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Jacob J. K. Javits Foundation. Blue earned her BA in Comparative History of Ideas from the University of Washington, where she was named Dean's Medalist in the Humanities, and she earned a doctorate in American Studies from Yale University. Dr. Ballou has held postdoctoral fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, Northwestern University, and Rutgers University. Her award-winning teaching centers on the broad themes of history of the present, conservatism, race, gender, violence, identity, and the meaning of war have been read and engaged by hundreds of thousands across the world. And so today, we are honored to have her here and to hear what she has to say about this very, very important topic. So today, I pass the microphone to Dr. Kathleen Ballou.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that wonderful and generous introduction. And thank you to Ghislaine and Josh and the interpreters who are here tonight, making this something that everyone can enjoy and engage with. And it's just really wonderful to see it framed in such an inclusive way. If you give me 1 second, I'm going to share my screen so we can look at some pictures. Okay. And you'll note here at the bottom that this will include some images from White Power Group materials. I'm not using anything with acts of violence pictured. I also want to just say on a personal note that I very much appreciate being invited to give this presentation in a community so close to the shooting in Buffalo just 6 months ago. It seems like not that long ago. This work is different for communities that have been attacked in this way directly by the white power movement. And I am grateful to be able to be of help in any way I can by sharing this history. Okay, let me just start really quickly with a few definitions so we can all be in the same conversation from the beginning. When I talk about white supremacy in this talk, I'm talking about the broad web of systems and beliefs that create and perpetuate racial inequality. So that includes individual overt racism, right? People who say and believe that they're racist in some capacity. It also includes all of the covert ways that racism has structured the way that we live our lives, even when overt racism and individual belief no longer has to be present to continue inequality. So we could think about this by thinking about imprisonment, hospitalization outcomes, education. There's all kinds of systems in our country where we don't have to have somebody in the room who's a overt racist in order to experience white supremacy as a problem. And I can say more about that in the Q&A if you'd like later. So I want to distinguish that right up top, because what I'm talking about here is within individual overt racist belief, a even smaller but very extremist and violent subset of people who believe that white people are superior. Sometimes they believe that only white people are even human beings, and who are interested in using violence to create a white space for themselves, whether that is an ethno-state or a nation or even a white planet. This is what I'm going to call the white power movement. I don't like the term white nationalism because I think it gets confusing. People sometimes think nationalism might simply be too much of a good thing, right? Like an overzealous patriotism. That's not what we're talking about. This is a overtly anti-American movement. So those are our terms: white supremacy, big web, white power movement, small radical extremist force, and white nationalism we might come back around to, but you won't hear me talking about it very much. Okay, so the people who forced their way into the US Capitol building on January 6th, 2021, intent on a show of force to disrupt the election, represent several different strands of right-wing activism. There were ardent supporters of former President Trump, including people in the Stop the Steal movement, and those ranged in sort of intensity from people who are simply there to attend a march to people who were there with the intent of breaking something. There were, in the second stream, people recently radicalized by QAnon, which is a different kind of conspiratorial belief, mostly involving online radicalization. And there was a third segment of this crowd. This one is the smallest, but it is the one that poses the biggest threat to our democratic system and to targeted communities. And this is the organized white power movement. The people in this segment are the ones that you saw on January 6th, moving through the hallways in tactical gear, the people who were organized with radios and other communication devices, the people who had stored weapons on or near the premises, the people who had made the plans for the building breach and urged others in the crowd to follow. The more we learn about this, the more it is confirmed by our courts, by our investigations, that the white power movement was not just one of the groups, but sort of the spark that ignited the fire. And we can talk later if you want to about the seditious conspiracy finding of 2 Oath Keeper leaders who were involved here, and I'll come back around to that too. But all of this is important to us today because this was not just a protest. This was not simply a normal tourist visit, as one of our lawmakers called it. This was also not meant to be a mass casualty attack. Was not a mass casualty attack. What this was a deliberate show of force, meant to show that extremist activists could strike at the heart of power, and that therefore other white people in the country ought to rise up and awaken, join the movement, and carry on continued campaigns of anti-democratic and anti-community of color violence nationwide. Now, this movement is not new. It did not just happen on January 6th. It did not just happen with the Unite the Right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is a long run of a movement that has toiled to undermine American democracy, its institutions, and to attack its people. And the history of this movement gives us a set of tools we can use in opposing it moving forward. Now, I'm going to move from here to another act of violence. The 1995 bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This one belongs on a very short list of American atrocities. It's the biggest deliberate mass casualty event in the United States between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. But it's different than those because both Pearl Harbor and 9/11 exist in our sort of shared narrative of the country. We learn about these events in high school history class, I hope, God willing. And we talk about them. They're in our pop culture. Oklahoma City is very different. Even as we marked the 25th anniversary of the attack just a few years ago, we lacked a coherent narrative about what this bombing was, what it meant, and what we needed to do to address the problem. And this was a big attack. 168 people were killed in the blast and its immediate aftermath. And this included 19 young children who were in the building's daycare center directly above the blast point. Now, many of us have visited the memorial, but the story we have about this bombing, about one or a few lone wolves or bad apples, or perhaps disaffected radicals. What we don't have is what it was, which is an act of domestic terrorism directly connected to a wide-ranging social movement that has largely gone unopposed from its formation in the late 1970s to the present. This misunderstanding has everything to do with the history leading up to the Oklahoma City bombing, and it's why we didn't deal with it then such that it could reemerge in our present moment. The movement responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, the white power movement, and later the white power movement / the militant right, was composed of a very broad array of groups and people. In every way but race, it was an incredibly diverse social movement. It included people across religion, and class. It included men, women, and children. It included people who served in the armed forces, active duty troops, and civilians. It included high school dropouts and felons alongside religious leaders and people with advanced degrees. There is no sort of movie of the week stereotype you can apply to this group of people that will give you an accurate reading of what this ideology means to people and how the movement works as a social network. It also brought together, as you see here, three groups that had been, at least three groups that had really been at odds with each other before. including Klansmen, neo-Nazis, radical tax resistors, Christian identity practitioners, white separatists, and later on skinhead and militia activists. These groups united with the explicit goal of attacking American democracy. And you'll see here this sort of cultural spread, right? If you see the woman on the left is a traditionalist Christian identity housewife wearing a long dress and holding her daughter. The woman in the middle is a camo-fatigued Aryan soldier who is ready for battle. And the woman on the right is a skinhead who is implied topless, heavy makeup, short hair. If you think about what it takes to get all of these women in the room together, accepting one another, you can have an idea of the kind of ideological gymnastics that's required for this all to work. We're going to talk about how it works and why. Now, people who want to understand fringe activism on the right have spent an enormous amount of time trying to sort and count everybody into groups. This is still how we usually encounter these stories today. Many people want to know who is a skinhead versus who is a Klansman, which is bigger, which symbol goes to which group, which slogan goes to which group, which is more violent, which has a headquarters near my community, et cetera, et cetera. But as we see here, this is not how it worked on the ground for these activists. This work of sorting and counting is inherently at odds with how white power activism actually worked on the ground. What we see in the archive is that people often moved between not only clan group to clan group, would we say, but from clan to skinhead to militia, or they had multiple memberships in more than one thing at a time. For instance, a skinhead in Southern California might have clan tattoos, attend a Christian identity church, and participate in neo-Nazi street actions. At the Aryan Nations compound in northern Idaho, where the movement regularly convened, Klansmen lit crosses or burned crosses for themselves, and then they also ignited swastika symbols for the neo-Nazis, and then everyone would together go to Christian identity sermons. White power activists used the story of being wronged by the government in the Vietnam War, being betrayed, to pull all these people together and also to mobilize a sense of focused violence against the state. Many people traded white robes and hoods in this period for camo fatigues. You'll see the man on the right here, although his camo is working, it's kind of hard to see the outline, but he's wearing a Klan hood made out of camouflage fatigue material. And they were also, besides the Vietnam War, they were motivated by an immediate sense of emergency because they believed that the host of social problems put forward by kind of capital C conservatism, including immigration, abortion, anti-gay movements, opposing feminism, we could go on. For white power activists, all of these things were considered to be problems because of their impact on the white birth rate. All of it had to do with this apocalyptic fear of the immediate extinction of the white race. In other words, they saw what most people have understood as a soft demographic transformation, or the moment when a nation or a state or a community was no longer majority white, as an apocalyptic threat to their movement. The unifying event of this movement happened in 1979 in Greensboro, North Carolina, when neo-Nazis and Klansmen banded together in a caravan to attack an anti-Klan demonstration in a Black community there. They opened fire, they killed the 5 people pictured here at the bottom of your screen. 4 of these were understood as white men in the newspaper accounts, although Cesar Cauce was Cuban. Sandy Smith was an African-American woman. And this is a really interesting example of the intersection between racial violence and our systems that are impacted by white supremacy more broadly that make it difficult to get accountability. Because what we have here is a clear, a clear incident of Klansmen and Nazis opening fire with serious weapons on a demonstration. 5 people are killed, many others are wounded, an entire community is impacted, and this shooting is caught on news camera, 3 different news cameras on scene. It lasts 88 seconds. You can see it all unfolding. But because of existing racial discrimination in the jury system, they are able to seat an all-white jury that is stridently anti-communist. You'll notice that the leftist demonstration was also a communist demonstration. And so all of the gunmen were acquitted on self-defense in the state trial. Then they tried for a federal conviction. And here they were trying to prove that the gunmen had conspired to deny the civil rights of the victims by killing them for reasons of race. The jury instructions said it had to be for reasons of race. But as you can see in the pictures, the image is wrong for reasons of race. And the jury didn't get to sort of go through the history of how white supremacy and anti-communism and anti-Semitism were all intertwined in this ideology. And the Klansmen and neo-Nazis were interested in killing communists as much as they were in killing African Americans. So they were acquitted again. But maybe the most stunning one is the finding of a later civil suit, where families were simply trying to get findings for the loss of their loved ones. The only death found wrongful was the one person in this group that was not a card-carrying communist at the time of his death. Effectively, our juries and legal system said that this was a legal action. And there's a deeply unfunny Saturday Night Live sketch about this that shows the opening day of quote unquote commie hunting season that basically makes that point. And I think the reason it's not funny is that it's absolutely what happened. Now, okay, so we have the coming together of the movement in 1979 with this act of violence. And if you're thinking here about the Charlottesville rally, I think that's the closest historical cognate to that event in our recent past. Now, the reasons we lost the thread, the reasons we lost the story of what was happening with this movement all come from the early 1980s. And this is a photo taken at Aryan Nations, which is sort of the center of the movement in many ways. In this time period, this is in northern Idaho, and you're looking at 2 members of the Order, which is a group I'm going to talk about in a minute. So Aryan Nations had a world congress that gathered together white power activists from all across the country every year for sort of a meeting / convention / summer barbecue. So they had, a big spaghetti dinner and volleyball and matchmaking. And then they also had like cross burnings and hit lists and racial speeches and things. The one in 1983 is special because in 1983, these activists decided mainstream politics will never deliver what we want. We are disappointed with Reagan, they decided. And therefore, we can no longer pursue politics. The time for the ballot has passed, as one of them says, and now it's time for the bullet. So in 1983, they declare war on the federal government. This happens at the convention, remember. So this is not one group. This is groups from all across the country. The entire movement pivots to declare war on the federal government. It does this with 2 strategies that leave us where we are today. The first one is leaderless resistance. Now, this is simply what we now know as cell-style terrorism, but it's before we knew about that. Leaderless resistance was imagined by the movement as a way to make it more difficult for FBI agents to get into Klan groups and cause trouble, which they had done quite a bit of in the civil rights era. And the idea was that one or a few activists could work together or work independently towards commonly held objectives, like assassinations and infrastructure attacks and bombings, without direct communication with other cells and without direct communication with movement leadership. Now, to be clear, there are leaders in leaderless resistance. It's just that there is no demonstrable connection between them and the violent act. It's a strategy that was designed to make it harder to infiltrate and harder for informants to take down groups. It was also designed to make it harder to prosecute these activists in court. But it's actually had a much more catastrophic impact, which is that this is where we get the completely incorrect trope of the lone gunman. This is where we get the lone wolf actor or a few bad apples, because leaderless resistance appears as an isolated attack instead of as part of a movement. This is how we get a story about Buffalo as a standalone attack on the African-American community. We get a story about the El Paso shooting as an attack on immigrants and the Latinx community there. We get the Tree of Life shooting as an attack on Jewish practitioners and the synagogue there. We get a story about Charleston as an attack on the Black worshipers there, instead of recognizing that all of those acts were perpetrated by white power gunmen who share an ideology, who share manifestos, who share language, who sometimes share direct connections and social networking, and should certainly be understood as part of a broader groundswell of activity. We'll come back to this in a minute. Now, so strategy number one coming out of the war on the state is leaderless resistance. Catastrophic, huge difference. It's something we're still living with now. The other thing that comes out of the war on the state moment is the second big technological breakthrough. And it is, believe it or not, the internet. Yes, we are in 1983-84. If you've heard about the recent problem of white power activism going online, this is something people like to report a lot. And we get this on a cycle, really. Sometimes they go all the way back to 1996 and talk about Stormfront, which was kind of the first major powerhouse website for neo-Nazi and Klan activists. But actually, LibertyNet pioneered all of this all the way back in 83-84. Now, this is before the internet proper. What we're talking about is computer-to-computer secure message boards. You'd have to have a code to log in. And this was all very, very new. Undergraduates, if you are with us, please, I'll come back. But so what happens is these guys that you're looking at are part of a group that is assassinating people, blowing things up, and then also stealing a lot of money, like a lot of money, millions of dollars from armored cars, from department stores, from hardware stores. And then one of the members of the order goes and distributes this money to people all around the country. Again, different groups, not one group. So they're distributing it to different people all around the country with instructions. They say, go out and buy an Apple mini computer. And this is where I would like the undergraduates, please, for a laugh later, go and Google mini computer, like the first one, and just check out what they thought was a mini computer. It's great. But computers are brand new. This is the year when in 1983, Time Magazine makes the computer the person of the year because everybody's so excited about all this new technology. So they're going to have to teach everybody how to do this. And we know that they did this because another activist from the order followed the same circuit of stops about a couple of months later, teaching everybody how to go online. Now, if LibertyNet were simply a message board, or simply basically like a recorded hate line, which they already had, where you could dial a number and hear the invective that they'd like you to know, then we wouldn't expect to see much social content. But on LibertyNet, we get assassination lists, we get ideological screeds, but we also see personal ads and recipes. It is really the first social network activism. They are not just now getting online. They are early adapters way back then. And it's important because these social connections are what create the infrastructure that they can build a violent movement on. Now, leaderless resistance also allowed this movement to organize along kind of differential levels of activity. So these numbers are a best guess. And in the Q&A, if you're interested, I am happy to talk to you about why I think nobody has a good head count of any of this, even in the 80s, but certainly not today. I don't think anybody can give you a real estimate. That's my opinion. But in the 80s, this is kind of the set of numbers that historians and sociologists generally agree on. So in the middle, we're talking about a very small group of people. In the middle, we're talking about 25,000, what people call hardcore activists. These are people who live and breathe the white power movement. They are people who separate themselves from non-white power social situations. They move to white power communities. They educate their kids in white power schools. They go to a white power church. And they're the people who are most likely to become violent actors within leaderless resistance structures. Outside of that, there's 150 to 175,000 people, and these are committed but less extremist activists. So perhaps they're, Klansmen, but they live in the suburbs and they have a lot of interaction with people who are not in the movement. Or perhaps they send money and go to demonstrations, but they really don't want to be involved in criminal activity, things like this. Outside of that is another 450,000 people. And here we're talking about people who don't send money, don't themselves subscribe to a newspaper, but regularly consume the ideas. Okay, so maybe somebody always passes them the paper after their friend finishes with it. It's worth noting, and we'll come back to this, that outside of that 450,000 circle would be an even bigger circle that is much more diffuse, where people would never pick up something called official newspaper of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, but who might agree with the ideas that are presented in it, especially if those ideas come to them through a friend or in a social situation of trust. This is the circle, that outer diffuse circle, that has the most capacity to sort of bleed unnoticed into the mainstream of our politics. And you'll notice that this is set up so that it can push ideas from the center out and pull people from the outside in towards radicalization. Okay. Okay. For time, I am going to skip quickly past the militia movement and just mention to you quickly that people have often thought of the paramilitary white power movement of the 80s as distinct from the militia movement of the 1990s, also called the Patriot movement. The sort of like, it's usually presented as anti-government instead of racist. The way we should think about it is this. If you have a Venn diagram, the big circle is the militia movement. The littler circle, but contained almost entirely inside the big circle, is the white power movement. All of the money, the guns, the people, the energy, the organizing ends up in the militia movement. So yes, there are some militias that are not overtly white power activist framed in this time period, but no, there's not a lot of daylight between them. They're marching shoulder to shoulder with white power activists, and they're sharing an enormous amount of resources and ideology. So it's something that we need to really think about before we allow there to be a clear dividing line between those two things. The other thing I'll mention is the reason we know that is because women in this time period have this frenetic output of activity. They're doing all kinds of things, and we can come back to this if we have time later. This one is a birth announcement circulated by the Aryan Women's League that urges everybody to send $1 every time a white family has a white baby, thus to, create funding for the white birth rate. The white birth rate thing is an interesting thing for women because it gives them this huge symbolic power. You'll see here some sort of idyllic images of women and white children because they need to have all these babies, but it also gives them some standing within the movement to create their own sort of authority through their motherhood and through their kind of moral spaces. We can talk more about that if you're interested. Now, so we have the sort of gathering storm of everybody getting online using leaderless resistance. That group I talked about, the Order, is carrying out a spate of violent actions across the country. There's a bunch more violence going on at various places. People are doing massive training at paramilitary camps. People are stealing tons, and I mean tons, literal tons, of army material and weapons and explosives from posts and bases, ending up in the hands of white power groups. They are also manufacturing their own weapons in this time period. It is a moment of frenetic activity. This brings us up to the real change point where we lose the story. In 1987-88, there is a seditious conspiracy trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So this is a federal trial. They're trying 13 people most of whom are representing themselves, which is just a mess. And some of the charges are seditious conspiracy. This is the one where we just got a conviction of 2 Oath Keeper leaders for seditious conspiracy yesterday. So seditious conspiracy means conspiracy, you were involved with a group of people making a plan to execute something. And then seditious means to attack or overthrow or otherwise damage the United States. Now, just to be clear, they were absolutely doing that. They said they were doing that. They were armed to do that. They had training for doing that. They had weapons and material for doing it. It was an enormous threat in many different ways. And many of them, including this man you're looking at, Louis Beam, followed a white power theology called Christian identity, which posits that white people are the true lost tribe of Israel, and everybody else, people of color, Jewish people, etc., are either descended from beasts or descended from Satan, depending on which strand you like better. And this is important because we're back again to the idea of the apocalypse. In Christian identity, so evangelical churches are gaining ground around the same time and becoming intensely political. And there's a lot of thought about the apocalypse. This is the period where we're getting, the late great Planet Earth and the Left Behind novels, and people are very concerned about the apocalypse. But in mainline evangelical belief, the idea is rapture, that you're going to be peacefully transported to heaven before the end times begin, if you're a believer. Christian identity has no rapture. The faithful are supposed to stay and take up arms and clear the world of enemies, which is, again, all non-white people, before Christ can return. So what this does is transmute the race war into a holy war. And this state of emergency and apocalyptic feeling is incredibly important for understanding how all those different activists are glued together in this groundswell. Okay, so the sedition trial was a big play by the government. They used plea bargains and evidence gathered in a number of smaller investigations across the 80s, including several prosecutions of members of the order. But it was a disaster. Everyone was acquitted. Instead of the slam dunk that they wanted, the DOJ got this picture under the headline, "Jubilant Racists Win Trial." Jubilant Racists Win Trial, I think, is not what anybody was going for. Despite enormous amounts of evidence and testimony, there were many, many problems. For instance, 2 jurors had romantic relationships with defendants during the trial, which I think we can all agree is not an impartial jury. There were chain of custody problems with a lot of important evidence that was apprehended with Louis Beam, this guy again, when he was on the run in Mexico. And the jury never saw the big arsenal of weapons, which included not only the usual AKs and AR-15s and M16s, but also included stolen weapons and munitions. It included anti-tank weapons. It included machine guns. It included homemade landmines and napalm, all of which, by the way, was returned after these activists were acquitted. The movement took this as a green light. This guy, again, Louis Beam, not only was not sorry, but immediately started a newsletter called The Seditionist. And people sort of doubled down on revolutionary activity. And this is when we see white power groups reform into militia. Then we quickly have 2 other events that are tragedies and also massive public relations disasters for the Department of Justice. One is the deaths of some white power activists who are evading prosecution in Ruby Ridge, Idaho, including Vicki Weaver, who's killed while carrying her 10-month daughter in her arms, and her 14-year-old son is shot just after. And then the other is the fiery end to the Waco siege in Texas. Now, Waco, just quickly, as an aside, is not a white power community. It was a multiracial kind of apocalyptic sect. But the white power movement doesn't care about that, and in fact talks about Waco as if it had been an all-white community. They only ever show pictures of the white people who died, etc. So this sort of triad of events, Sedition, Trial, Ruby Ridge, Waco, does two things. First of all, it inflames the militia movement, because all of these activists who are worried about the power of the federal government now have two very clear recruiting events to use, and they have the green light of the sedition trial. They have the sense they won't be prosecuted. The other thing it does is cow the government response. One journalist saw a policy on paper, which I have not myself seen, but he saw an institutional change to pursue only individual actors in white power violence, with no attempts to tie individual crimes to a broader movement. So we have a policy to pursue only individual actors and make no attempts to tie individual crimes to a broader movement. And that policy is on the books when McVeigh blows up the Oklahoma City federal building. From the beginning, the Oklahoma City investigation followed the same myth that the white power movement had created with leaderless resistance, and that journalists had allowed by recirculating these stories. And it's the myth of the lone wolf. Occasionally, we get ideas about a few bad apples when we talk about co-conspirators, but really the outcome is the same. The bombing was remembered as the work of one or a few people. Now, the evidence to the contrary is overwhelming, and I am going to give you only a very small amount of it here. It is a full chapter in my book if you'd like to go and look at all of the details and all of the footnotes. But here's a short list. He chose a building that had been a movement target since the early 1980s. McVeigh used and distributed the movement novel, The Turner Diaries, in formulating his plan for the bombing. McVeigh was present as a high-level security operative for movement leadership in the Michigan militia. He had contacts and attempted contacts with white power groups, Arizona Patriots, the National Alliance, and a white separatist compound in Elohim City, which, by the way, had also sheltered members of the order when they were on the run. He chose the date of the bombing siege, or the bombing, not only on the anniversary of the Waco siege, but also on the planned execution date of a prominent white power activist who had once targeted the same federal building in Oklahoma City. There is additional evidence, it is abundant, but a simple social geography of McVeigh's life and beliefs places him decisively as a foot soldier in the white power movement and follower of the strategy of leaderless resistance. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing did not reduce the violent ambitions of white power activists. Actually, militia groups increased afterward. They marched on Washington, D.C. afterward, and Stormfront opened just afterward, bringing the movement online in a much more effective way than LibertyNet had, but following in the steps of that site. This brings us up to where we are and what we know now. And this is also the end of what I'm saying to you as a historian. From here on, what I'm talking to you about is simply a historian reading the news and giving historical context to what we're seeing now. This movement burst back onto the scene in 2017 with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. After that, if you've been paying attention to some of it, you will have seen mentions of the Proud Boys in presidential debate, politicians deciding not to decry meetings with white separatists in all kinds of different ways, and growing violence, both violence and fatalities. I want to get, okay, I'm skipping a few things that we can go back to in Q&A, but I want to just quickly go over one other thing that we need to know in order to have this conversation. And this gets us back to January 6th again. It's impossible to understand any of this without spending a moment on a dystopian novel called The Turner Diaries. And let me just quickly say, if you would like to read this book, which I don't particularly recommend, it's a bad book, and reading what people have written about it might be more helpful to you if you're interested in learning about this. But if you do read it, please don't go buy a new one, because sometimes the money makes its way back to these groups. There are excellent PDFs circulating online. So the Turner Diaries. It's hard to overstate why the Turner Diaries is so important, but it has been a cultural lodestar of this movement from the late 1970s when it was written all the way up till now. We see it over and over again appearing in the material culture of this movement. They kept stacks of them in the bunkhouse of the order, like 15 copies in a bunkhouse. They were distributed for free by the White Patriot Party. Timothy McVeigh sold them in the gun shows. He carried them in his trunk, and he had a photocopy of part of the book with him when he was arrested. I could go on, but it's incredibly important. And the reason it's important is not because it's a good book. In fact, it's a terrible book, but because it lays out the answer to a seemingly insurmountable problem, which is, how can a tiny fringe movement hope to overthrow the most militarized superstate in world history, the United States government? And what the Turner Diaries lays out is a leaderless resistance style campaign of asymmetrical warfare, sabotage, infrastructure attacks, and violent recrimination against quote unquote race traitors that eventually delivers them to an all-white planet. I cannot overstate how violent this book is. It includes the genocide of all people of color in the world. It includes something called the Day of the Rope, where they hang all the race traitors and all the professors and all the journalists and all the communists and, everybody else who's a problem. It's an incredibly profoundly violent book. The Oklahoma City bombing plot comes from a grisly scene in the Turner Diaries. I emphasize that here to say that the Turner Diaries also has in it an attack on the Capitol that is not a violent attack. It is meant to be a selective show of force, the targeting of just a few powerful people to send a message to other white people that they should rise up and join the movement. That's why the body count was so low on January 6th, because it was not supposed to be a mass violence attack. Now, to be sure, I think that they were interested in violence. I think that had people not gotten our lawmakers out of the way, certainly some people would have been killed. But the reason the body count is so low is because it fits in the playbook of this movement. And we have to understand that in order to figure out how to combat it. Now, I think I would like to leave it there. The other thing I'll just mention is that this week, we have an incredible news cycle where there are multiple stories going on at the same time that are all about this. We have the Mar-a-Lago dinner with Nick Fuentes, Ye, and Trump, and Milo Yiannopoulos. We have the findings in the Buffalo case where the verdicts came down as being racially motivated. We have the news that Proud Boys have been elected to local leadership and Republican positions in Oregon and elsewhere. And we have the seditious conspiracy finding in the Oath Keepers trial. I bring all that up just to say it is incredibly hard to keep all of this in view in real time. This is why the history is so important. It gives us a way to slow down, expand our view beyond the day's headlines, and figure out how to connect the dots in order to better confront this threat to our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If we could clear this share screen, that would be great.
I'm working on it. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ballou, for very, very provocative and engaging historiography of white supremacy and white supremacist acts and engagements. If you want to ask a question, please submit it anytime through the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen. I was remiss earlier to thank those folks who have assisted us here to make sure that all folks are communicated well with, our captioners and interpreters who are ensuring that this program is accessible to everyone. So thank you so much for the work that you are doing for us. Now, I guess I am supposed to do something here that kind of, responds a little bit to some of the suppositions of Dr. Ballou. But I think so much of what you said has really shaped for us the landscape on which we find ourselves. I really love, and love is hard, right? Like as many people who are viewing have added in their Q&A, they've asked these questions of like, why, like, what does it mean to study these groups? How does it feel, right? Every time I saw an image, I have to say, I was like, oh God, and every time you might have enumerated, right, the presence of an organization that was fighting, that was advancing white supremacy, I had to think of the many organizations that are fighting against white supremacy, Black Lives Matter and the Southern Leadership Conference and so many other, NAACP and Urban League, and right, so many organizations that are named and unnamed, community-based organizations, which really, really counter, right, white supremacists. And so I want to remind our viewers that, even as we historicize these white supremacist organizations, which are very important, and this is the project that we are here today to talk about, I also want to remark upon the very importance of the Black and brown folks and queer folks and so many other folks who are trying to tear apart, right, this kind of what we might call the organizing fiber of this, even our country. And so that said, right, there's a lot I want to say in terms of thinking about a kind of other way, all right, of reading white supremacy that I think your project and your talk today actually provoked for me, right? And it was the question that kept coming to me was, a question of my friend Stephanie Lee, who is writing a really wonderful book called Ugly White People, right? And in this book, what she supposes is that all of these scenes that you trace, right, really do in fact excite a certain kind of ugliness that has been a part of the historiography and the historical, the history of white people in not only America, but across the world, right? And so what does that mean? That means that there must be something about whiteness itself, right? The way in which whiteness is revered and or kept in check or made precious, right? That sustains this white supremacist ethos, right? And so for me, my question over and over again is, when will white folks give up, right, this love for whiteness, right? And so how do we teach our children this? And I'm not just talking about white children. I'm talking about, how do I teach my son, right? How does he give up this interest in whiteness? Daddy, why is my skin brown? Daddy, why am I not white? Daddy, so-and-so said I'm Black. Daddy, right? And these questions are not about his Blackness, right? They're not about Black culture. They're about this kind of historic preoccupation with whiteness and this preciousness, right, that is given to whiteness, this idea that whiteness is so precious. And it's not just gendered, right? I do love what you said about the mothers, right? This notion that white women as mothers, right, become these kind of precious objects, which of course is its own kind of sexism, right? White misogyny, right? And this idea that white women are default mothers, right? And not only are they default mothers, but they are mothers of a different brand, right? Other mothers, we can do to them what we will, but white mothers need to keep having babies, right? And so this perpetual sensation that seems to be in our country around whiteness itself, right? This perpetual line of thinking that whiteness itself is precious, right, seems to continue and it needs to be protected. And so what I want to extend here is that it's not just about whiteness as what we wear, but it's also the way in which we have presumed that even buildings that are brick buildings are in our imaginary white buildings, that even statues that are molded in clay that are brown are in our imagination white statues, that even the kind of the Bible that's clearly Black, right? The Bible, right, is a Black book, right? Has been imagined and perpetually is imagined as a white text. And Jesus, right, who has historically been understood by most people who live on the continent and beyond as brown and definitely Black in the context of that moment, is somehow transmogrified in history as being white. And that, to me, is also a part of the conversation. And so I really, really am so thankful for you. And I want to make sure we have your mic on. I don't know if you can, so we could dialogue about this. But that was kind of my entry point. Like you revved me up to think about this other kind of.
That's such an exciting response. Yeah. So I mean, like, my brain goes to, so let me start by saying how I got into this project is directly related to that. Because I think when if you go to graduate school and start to read about whiteness and white supremacy, one of the first things that I noticed was that the United States is hardly alone in having a long history of racial violence. I'm thinking here of the work of George Frederickson, among others, but there are many places that have had racial violence, racial inequality, institutionalized and legal systems of racial inequality, bans on interracial marriage, we can go on. But where the United States is very, very weird is how little we have had by way of public conversation and reckoning with that history. And I think it is that lack of conversation that lets all of this act as this ghost force in our society. Poor choice of words since we're talking about the Klan, but do you know what I mean? Like it's sort of like now I want to say invisible hand, but you get what I mean. Like it's as an unrecognized player in the room when we're thinking about, the example that comes to mind is classical art. I just saw an exhibit on the famous Greek statues that were held up in the 19th century as like the archetype of whiteness. Turns out were brightly colored when they were made, and they were only white like that because they had been bleached over many, many centuries. But it doesn't matter because the fiction is of this marble white skin, right? And all of that gets created. And I think what we're missing is that historical component about the construction of whiteness over time. Yeah. There's some fascinating work about this if people would like to read more. As I'm sure you already have, Jeffrey, but thinking about things like what counts as white in context of the US Census, what counts as white on a birth certificate, what counts as white on a property deed. All of these are moving targets over time. And then the second part I would say about that, so sorry, let me finish so I started this project wanting to know about truth and reconciliation processes in the United States, which have only been attempted on the very local NGO level, not with government buy-in, or at least they hadn't been at the time when I was starting this work in 2005. And that took me to a TRC done in Greensboro, North Carolina, about that shooting that I talked about. And I sort of started researching this movement because of something that people from Klan and Nazi groups were saying there about how, well, they killed communists in Vietnam, so why wouldn't they kill them in the United States? And that was, one of those loose threads on the sweater that I couldn't stop pursuing. Yeah. But the bigger point about what do we do with our racial history in this country, I think is urgent and pressing. And, since then we've had a lot of movement, right? We have the lynching memorial in Montgomery now. We have the AFAM Museum on the Mall in DC. There are a number of smaller projects in Montgomery and elsewhere. There's a lot of movement about this, and things that I never learned about in high school, like Tulsa, are now knowledge. I just saw a wonderful picture book for grade schoolers about the Tulsa race riots. That's not something I would have ever imagined even a few years ago. So I think all of this is moving very quickly. And the other way I know it's moving very quickly is that even something like Make America Great Again is a historical argument. That's making a claim about time and place. We should have that argument, but we have to use history to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's really great. There are so many questions, Kathleen, that as I would love to go more. And folks hear me talk in these streets all the time. as the Frederick Douglass, the director of the Frederick Douglass Institute and the Department of Black Studies. So they don't need to hear from me. They are here to hear from you, but particularly to hear you kind of address some of their questions. And of course, we'll dialogue about them together. But, one of the opening questions, right, and you kind of danced on this, that one of the viewers asked, is the basis of the white supremacist movement fear of the other?
Yes. Sorry, I'm just answering in the chat. A TRC is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for people that aren't familiar.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, yes. So fear of the other is a big part of it. The trick here is that there seem to the radicalization and de-radicalization literature is, to my mind, very new and therefore somewhat incomplete. There are studies of kind of the psychological makeup of people who go into these groups, and there are some studies about people entering and leaving. For instance, Robert Pape, my colleague at U Chicago, did a study where he found that a majority of January 6th participants came from counties with significant immigration rates. So social change is the push factor. But what you see in the historical archive is a little bit more complex than that, as history tends to be. So there are people who enter this movement because of fear of the other, or just straight up old school racism, or their father raised them in the Klan, and so they're going to be in the Klan, and sort of the set of explanations I was expecting, or because they lost their job to a person of color, or there's one community where there's an influx of Vietnamese refugees, and then everybody gets kind of radicalized around that by the Klan coming in and doing that to the community. But there are also people who land in this movement for very personal reasons, like, well, my husband knew a guy and we had a 2-year-old and this church had childcare. Or, I was following my husband into it and then I found a way to da-da-da-da. So there are many different ways in. And this gets back a little bit to what you were saying about women too, Jeffrey, that they are definitely not just symbolic participants. They are also, they in the archive, they will say, I am not an activist, I'm not doing anything political, while they are doing things like driving getaway cars and writing important documents and disguising people when they're on the run and designing things like secret medallions. So all of it is, I think, complex and multi-layered. I've started thinking about it more as push and pull factors, right? So you might get pushed into the movement by factors like huge demographic change in your community or losing your job, or you might get pulled in through a social relationship or outright recruitment or things like that. But I think there's a lot of different routes in and a lot of different routes out. And this goes a little bit to the question about groups doing de-radicalization. The questioner asks about Life After Hate and Parents for Peace. Those are excellent groups. De-radicalization in your own community is a great place to put your energy if you would like to do something about this, because the problem with de-radicalization is that it's incredibly difficult to scale. The model that seems to be working is really quite a lot like something, as somebody said to me, it's a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's like close relationships and resources and interpersonal connection is what works. It's not something that like the government can just do for us, or that like a local city council can just put in place. It's something that involves a lot of interpersonal work. And although I hesitate to say that that's where all resources should go, because these are people who have become perpetrators, it is one of the things that we will need to approach if we want to deal with this problem.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, there's another question from good Sir Lance Drummond, who asked this question: is the crux of white supremacy based on the fear of non-whites gaining power and prestige?
So sort of, yes. This fear of it's yes, but it's refracted into something much more scary than that. So the difference is between this is too many immigrants and the idea that this is so many immigrants that they will outbreed us and we will be extinct, and that will be the apocalypse, right? So the level of emergency is huge. All of these issues, interracial contact, all of it is about the birth rate at the end of the day.
So my take on this is something that I don't think we're ready to do, right? So like, we understand that, right? We understand that there is a commitment to a certain kind of what in high theoretical terms we call hetero reproductivity, right? But we're really talking about the idea that everybody is supposedly have children. I'm supposed to have my son. My mother told me when I was 5, you're gonna have a son, right? Like or a daughter, 5 kids, right? Whatever, right? Your parents probably told you something, or your grandparents, or whomever. We all grew up, many of us, not all, but many of us grew up with these narratives, and we buy into the real importance of producing family, and that producing family means having more babies, right? That construct, right, grows out of, right, a very nuclear notion of family that perpetuates, right, the advancement of whiteness, right? It's like we need more, and not only just the advancement of whiteness, but also the advancement of laborers, right? So it's okay to have more Black children if in fact we're going to use them for prison, free prison labor, right? It's okay to have more Latinx children come into the world, and we can adopt them and turn them white, right? But you get what I'm saying? Like there is a whole systemic idea of reproduction. And so part of what I want to challenge here as we think about that issue is that we all have to disinvest in the narration of this idea of reproduction. Oh, reproduction. Oh, that's gonna save everybody. We need to have, anti-abortion, right? That is actually interesting, right? That kind of logic is really actually hurting us.
So, and it's sort of, I think what you're asking also is sort of how this fits into a schema of racial capitalism, or just thinking about how whiteness both has a monetary value in our larger society, and also how reproduction works within that system. And I'm totally available for that discussion. I will just say that what they're doing in the 80s is not so easily fit in, because it's that, and then again, state of emergency apocalypse, right? They need warriors, and they even talk about like, we need everybody. This is how they're solving the problem of like, how are we going to be okay with these hard drinking tattooed skinheads? That's a huge jump for Christian identity people. So they are willing to take everybody because it's an emergency. And then they write quite widely about, okay, all women have to have at least 4 children before they become a warrior and put their life on the line for the cause. And in order to do that, they're okay with some things that are very beyond the pale. They sanction polygamy for the purest white warriors so that they can have the most children. They are okay with breaking marriages when there is barrenness or difficulty in having children. There's all kinds of loopholes that are discovered in order to sort of make this reproduction project happen. But you can also see, in addition to racial capitalism, we should be thinking about settler colonialism, because the other thing they do in the 1980s is say, okay, we are all going to move to the Northwest. It's the only area of the country that is still wide enough to be salvaged. Their words, not mine. We're going to have as many babies as we can, and we're going to win this territory with our love for each other. We are going to outbreed the enemy. I am quoting right now. So, by the way, they are totally fine with Native Americans. They really like them. And my theory about this is that it fits into their sort of frontier ethos. And what they're envisioning in ethno-states is actually very much like a reservation system. So I think they're okay with Native American neighbors because they are constrained in the way that they want everybody constrained. They look ahead to sort of, an African-American reservation in the South, and a Latinx reservation in the Southwest, and then a white bastion in the Northwest. So it's sort of like you can see these bigger forces and historical models working, but also it's like the upside down of all of those.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful. So we have several questions. I want to keep moving. I like the way you're moving, so we can get through this. Is great. So I'm not going to go to the solutions question because we'll get to some of those solutions a little bit later. But there's a question here that I want to make sure that we get in. So one of the things that you showed was the Trumpian January 6th, I'm sorry, this, but Trumpian January 6th, riot, and I almost don't even like using the term riot or insurrection, right? Neither of those terms I like to use. I think you used a term that I liked, and I can't remember what it was, but the January 6th happening, the white supremacists happening, they called that, someone asked, how would you argue that was a leaderless?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So here's what we need to remember about the relationship between this and Trump. This is a marriage of convenience, and Trump has been incredibly important to this movement in a couple of very important ways. The big one is that he has opened the door to much more mainstream acceptability than existed before. He's brought bits of this movement into our mainstream politics, into public acceptance, into first non-condemnation and then something more than that. So he is looked on favorably by this movement right now, broadly speaking. But here's what we have to remember. This is an opportunistic movement. This is how white power and clan groups always work. It is opportunistic. It will use whatever the window of opportunity is that is presented. In other words, they would be, I think, perfectly happy for Trump to be reelected and to support him in an authoritarian state. I think that would work very well for them. But I also think that they don't care very much about whether it's Trump or somebody else. I think it is very opportunistic, and it is not just a cult of personality. And I bring that up to say that there's been a lot of talk about like, oh, the midterms rolled back a lot of the sort of big lie candidates. Oh, he got repudiated. The announcement wasn't very good. Like, maybe we're done with all of this. And I mean, as somebody who's been through this news cycle before, already I have, grain of salt about all of that. But even if we set that aside, even if Trump were ousted somehow, even if he was a non-contender in 2024, this does not go away. It does not go back in the box, because this is built to simply seek the next opportunity. That's what I mean by leaderless resistance. It certainly seems, although we don't have all the evidence yet, that Trump knew quite a bit about what was going to happen on January 6th. But again, leaderless resistance doesn't mean no leaders. It means no demonstrable ties to leadership. So what we should be looking for is how these cells were interconnected, which we know that they were, how they were prepared, which we know that they were, and what the impact of the action would have been.
Yeah, that's good. So one of the things you got me thinking about, Kathleen, is this, I almost don't even want to smile about this stuff, right? Like, it's like I smiled. No, I don't want to smile about this, right? One of the things you got me thinking about, right, is shadow leadership, right? So what are some of the kind of shadow participants, right? And so I'm thinking about the question here, for these radicalized groups, are the religious underpinnings these radicalized groups, are the religious underpinnings an excuse, not having a general worry about what rapid popular growth means, but really an excuse for capture, like advancing this notion of the rapture, right? So as in, like the Christian objective, right? This objective of the afterlife, right? And so what I hear in that question, it's a very loaded question, but I also hear a question that's asking, is religion in some senses a shadow participant in white supremacy?
Well, I think I might want to say that, we need to be figuring out to what extent white supremacy is a shadow participant in religion. I think, so just to zoom out a little, what we're looking at, and I am happy to provide an additional history book reading if people would like to like get into this. This is like a tick. I have to tell you all the books that are great about this, but what's happened since the Reagan years has been a intense politicization of religious space. And I'm talking about both, there is more politics in our churches, and there are more churches in our politics. So we can trace this through the growth of evangelical congregations, through the growth of political lobbies, through the kind of intertwined power of conservative talk radio and Christian radio, and through the kind of assumed Christianity of some parts of the right. Now, it's tricky in the white power movement because, again, diverse in every way but race, right? So we're talking about, and I mean, we also should talk about how that every way but race thing is melting down a little bit more now that we have
Kathleen, you're breaking
Latinx
up
and
a
Black
little bit.
participants in these movements. It's very common, and we can talk about what we. No, am I back?
Yep, when you're forward, it's great. It's when you
Am I
back
here?
up.
Did I
Yeah,
freeze?
you're good. We got you. You're good.
Oh, and I'll stay right here. I'll stay right here. So I was just saying that within the white power movement, it's tricky because, again, that emergency diversity thing means that there are actually a lot of religions in the white power movement in the 80s. So Christian identity is the big one. But first of all, they're okay with multiple affiliations again. So Louis Beam described himself as identity Baptist. So he could attend Christian church or Baptist church or both. Meanwhile, there are a lot of neo-pagans in the movement in the 80s who are into Odinism and Norse gods and things like this. Because again, it's supposed to be about white heritage and, I don't know, white gods or something. So that the Odinism seems to be not as big a thing as it was. But I just really think it is within white power militant right circles. I really think the model is accept everything because we're in an emergency. Now, part of the emergency is deeply resonant with religious belief because this apocalypse thing has a home in a lot of our mainline and evangelical Christian congregations. And I think that's a complicated knot that I'm trying to untangle in my next book. So, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, you broke up just quite a bit at the end, but there we are again. So here's what I heard you say, which I think is really important, and I think this gets at. There's a couple books that I know have come out. Some of the guests have asked about books, but I know you're gonna give some too. There's a book by Anthea Butler, who actually used to be a professor here at University of Rochester, who just published this book called White Evangelical Racism. Right. Really interesting book, The Politics of Morality in America. That's White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America by Anthea Butler. There's another book that I read a long time ago, something like White Man's Magic. And it dates back, like it's about Eloquai, might be right now, my brain's dead, but Equianos. Equianos and kind of the way in which Equiano was exposed to religion, right? And takes us through this kind of idea of white evangelical Christianity as a certain kind of magicianship, right? Pulling people in. But then there's also this other rhetoric, because I also want to talk to the other folks who are here. I know there are non-white people here who say things like Christianity is not the white man's religion, right? And I agree to some extent, right? I think that we have to contend, once again, I'm going to keep pushing this the whole conversation, right? Is that we have to contend with our relationship to institutions requires us in this hour, this America, to just really be honest that these institutions are built with pillars that are not of non-white people's making, right? And so the shadow participant, right, for even my most staunch Black Baptist church, right, has within it, right, some of this kind of white evangelical tenets that advance a notion of, beauty and whiteness, or, sin is related to difference, right? That perpetuates over and over again white supremacy or advances anti-Blackness, right? So I really think that your questions are really raising our level of consciousness around the many ways in which this stuff is just buried. And not sometimes even buried, it's kind of like sitting behind. And if you unveil these things, you'll see, baby, so many things that we are kind of subscribing to actually have these kind of shadow, kind of like, we want you to kind of believe in this so we can continue to advance our proposition because it jives with yours. So when you say something like Christianity is not a white man's religion, it's depending on if you're talking about the dominant hegemonic form of Christianity within this country, or are you talking about some kind of isolated version that is kind of flexible? But then my mother will say, oh, there is no flexible Christianity. Well, it has to be if we're going to write out white supremacy, the same way that we had to do that when we know that white supremacist religion was used to enslave people.
Right. Well, and I think with religion, it's always, I'm not a trained religious studies person or a trained historian, and I grew up Unitarian, so I grew up real confused about all of it, let's just say. But I think one of the interesting things is to just look at the way that I think, again, the history can help here, because some of the pillars that we think of as forever pillars in Christianity come to us quite recently. And knowing even the recent 200 years version history of, for instance, biblical translation, biblical depiction of images, all of these things happened. These changes and additions came out at the same time that society was inventing this category of whiteness and refining this category of whiteness.
Yes.
So I think it's worth all of our time to interrogate how much of that is still useful to us. And I think people of faith can do that without throwing out the entire
abandoning their faith, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have to abandon your faith. You just might have to abandon a couple of these interpretations of scripture. Okay, so I'll stop there. I'll get some emails later, but that's okay. We are almost coming up for time, and so I want to make sure that we answer one final question, because I get this all the time. I think discourse is productive, and that we got people thinking, and that folks will actually take from us and go with us and begin to really think about these complex issues, and then take them into their communities and their homes and their families, right? And so I know you'll do that work, and that's part of the work. But the final question is, what can we do individually? And we actually have like a minute and a half to answer this, but what can we do individually? And I'm going to give it to you, Kathleen, and collectively to stop these movements from growing in our communities.
My favorite question, and you don't need me to tell you in a community close to an impacted site how immediate this is and how desperate this is. I think the first thing to do, particularly for people who are near Buffalo, know people in Buffalo, is to do the work of connecting, seeking justice in Buffalo, and seeking to combat the problem locally with communities that have also been impacted. So reaching out to activists in Charlottesville, in Portland, in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, because resources are not the same in all of these places. There is different, there are different levels of media savvy, money, kind of speaking podiums. And to the extent that we can all work together as being impacted by the same perpetrator, I think that's a really powerful position to take. I think that's all of us after January 6th. I really do. But that's going to be a case we have to make. And I think people who have faced this violence in their own community are in a unique place to say something about it. And then the other thing I'll say is that, and I say this to everybody, and it's a really big ask, so please bear with me, but just continuing to pay attention to this is hugely important. And the reason I know that that's such a big ask is that I know it is a fire hose of impossible news. on Twitter, on the New York Times homepage, on your local paper, wherever you're getting your news. There are so many crises, there are so many emergencies, and it's very difficult to connect all these dots and keep it in view, but we have to. We really have to. Our democracy and our community safety depend on it. So to the extent that you can do that, I think that's huge. And, you know, you guys are here on a Wednesday night after work. I so appreciate that. And taking the time to engage conversations like this is a huge step. And I'm very grateful to you for being here.
Yes. And we are grateful to you for being here and being such an excellent speaker and such a generous spirit with your knowledge of history and your awareness of the critical ways in which this really impacts each and every one of us. I really just want to thank you. I know that so much of what you're saying too is that while we have to be critically conscious, we also have to be critically aware of the ways in which some of us, right, even extend, right, some of these actions, right, by downplaying them, by not talking about them, by acting as if, oh, this is not this is not a riot, this is not an insurrection, this is not a lawless, situation, this is not some kind of violence, right? It is, and we hear it because people are crying and dying, right, as a result of these actions, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thank you to everybody who's joined in and those folks especially who are in the fight every day. We invite you to stay tuned for our next installment of the Real Conversations in partnership with the Office of Minority Student Affairs for the Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative address on January 20th, 2023. As always, more information will be available on the Real Conversations website. Thank you again. I want to say that that's January 20th, 2023. That's the Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative address. I actually am going to be a part of that and very excited about that conversation as well. Thank you again to the Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement and the Diversity Advisory Council in partnership with the Frederick Douglass Institute and Department of Black Studies, the University Equity and Inclusion Office, School of Medicine and Dentistry, and the Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion. You'll now be directed to a brief survey to share your feedback on this program and an opportunity to suggest ideas for future events. We thank you again for your participation here. Miliora, good night.